Hello again, book lovers, and it's the turn of Holy Warriors by Jonathan Phillips, a modern history of the Crusades. And that's exactly what it is. It's a history of the Crusades. If you've read about the Crusades, you might not be interested in this. However, I have read a lot about the Crusades, and I was still interested in this book as giving a nice overview. It'd be a great one to start with if you really don't know anything about the Crusades. For example, we get all the famous battles and some not so famous. We get all the famous people and some not so famous. Why is it a modern history? Because it includes some Muslim source references in chapter 2. Very interesting. We have the testimony of Al-Sulami, followed by that of Usama ibn Munkid, none of whom were very great friends of the Crusaders. So it's interesting to hear it from the Arab point of view. And the final chapter is called New Crusaders, which examines the post-history of the Crusades, how Walter Scott gave it its kind of chivalric gloss, how people like Osama bin Laden, George Bush, and several Middle Eastern leaders have all seen themselves as extensions of, continuations of, reflections of the Crusade. Crusade, by the way, was a word which didn't have an Arab equivalent until maybe 200, 300 years ago. They were known to the Arabs as jihads, of course they were. That problematic word that London policemen had to have explained to them in recent demonstrations. And not very honestly explained, I might add. Another thing is that they didn't call the invaders the Christians or the Europeans. They were known as the Franks. And there's no wonder that is the case, because the majority seem to have been Frankish soldiers, and France itself seemed to consider itself as the hub of these crusading armies, presumably on the back of the crusade of Louis IX, which is one of the later crusades. Anyway, here you'll get the heroes and villains. Here's a nice new villain that you might not have heard of. His name is Zengi, an Arab leader of whom Ibn al-Adim says, when he rode, the troops used to walk behind him as if they were between two threads, out of fear that they would trample the crops. Because if anybody should do that, they were likely to get crucified. He also had a wife he wasn't very pleased with, so he sent her to the stables to get gang-raped by the grooms. So let's add Zengi to our list of villains. On the other hand, Fulk and Melisande are coming into Jerusalem as invaders, and yet don't seem to be quite so fearsome. On page 74 we are told that Melisande had to masculinize, of course, but this is de rigueur. I think when talking about any powerful women in the past we have to pretend they never existed, except for a very few. And we get plenty of, as I said, sources from the Muslims of the time, although in a nice quote at the bottom of page 338, Mr. Phillips tells us, one writer notes these epics, quote, tread gingerly along the shoreline of historical fact, close quote. Marvellous way of putting it, but we're not told who the original author is, so I can't tell you. Anything that I didn't know in this book? Well, yes, apart from what I've already mentioned, there were the Christians against Christians battles, there were the Sunni against Shia battles. Also, Saladin was not as known as the great leader among the Muslims until he was sort of pumped up by the Europeans later on. The reason for this may be that he destroyed the Shia Caliphate of Cairo in 1169, so that would be pretty divisive. And here we lean into the Christian/Muslim alliance against our man Zengi, who was getting a bit too powerful. A nice quote from Winston Churchill prefaces one of the chapters. It says, "The further back you look, the further forward you can see." And that's one of my perspectives on the study of history. If you study enough, nothing surprises you anymore. Although I will end with one little surprise, to me at any rate, where we find an echo of the famous football matches that took place in the trenches of World War I between the enemies, the Germans and the English. But guess what? During the siege of Acre, which dragged on and on, as Beha ad-Din tells us, quote, they got to know one another, in that both sides would converse and leave off fighting. At times people would sing and others dance, so familiar had they become over time, and then, after a while, they would revert to fighting. What a rather nice metaphor for the human condition. Good book to read if you're starting out wanting to know something about Crusades. Entertaining also if you want another revisory whisk through of the main characters and events, and some of the minor ones as well.